The rain had turned the boulevard into a black river when Callum Ray saw the woman fall. One moment she was stumbling beneath the streetlights, barefoot and soaked in a torn evening dress. The next, her knees struck the pavement and she collapsed directly in front of his truck. Callum slammed on the brakes so hard that his daughter's empty booster seat toppled behind him. He rushed into the storm and found the stranger trembling beside the curb, one hand pressed against her swollen ankle and the other clutching a small silver key. When he tried to lift her, she looked past him at the headlights approaching through the rain and whispered, "I can't walk. Leave me." Callum should have listened. He was a struggling single father with a child waiting at home, unpaid bills in his glove compartment, and no room in his life for another disaster. But then he noticed the terror in her eyes, and the dark sedan slowing at the end of the street. Callum tightened his grip around her and said the only word that would change all their lives, "No." Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Oxley Stories if you believe kindness can still find people on their worst night and that everyone deserves a second chance. And tell us where you're watching from tonight, because somewhere across the world, another person may need to hear that compassion is never wasted. Callum carried her toward his truck as the sedan rolled closer, its headlights sweeping across the rain. The woman was surprisingly light, but every step made her gasp against his shoulder. He placed her in the passenger seat, hurried around the hood, and pulled away just as the sedan stopped beside the place where she had fallen. In the mirror, a tall man in a dark coat stepped into the road and watched them disappear. Callum expected the woman to explain, but she kept her head down, breathing in short, painful bursts. Her wet hair clung to her face, and a thin line of blood ran from her temple. When Callum asked whether she needed a hospital, she grabbed his wrist with sudden strength and begged him not to take her anywhere that required identification. That frightened him more than the sedan had. Hospitals were where injured people went. Only people hiding from someone refused to be seen, and Callum had just brought one of them into the only vehicle registered to his name. His first instinct was to stop at a police station, but the nearest one was 6 blocks behind them, in the same direction as the sedan. His second instinct was to call emergency services, yet the woman shook her head before he could touch his phone. She said her name was Sabine Vale, though even that came out with hesitation, as if she had not decided whether to trust him with it. She claimed she had escaped from a charity gala after discovering that someone she trusted had been stealing money, but her story broke apart whenever he asked for details. She could not explain why she was barefoot, why her phone was missing, or why the men following her were willing to chase her through a storm. Then Callum noticed bruises around her wrist, shaped like fingers. Whatever she was hiding, someone had tried to stop her from leaving, and the thought made him glance again at the empty booster seat behind him. His 6-year-old daughter, Nessa, had already lost one parent. Callum could not risk making her lose another because he had mistaken danger for an opportunity to be heroic. He turned toward the small house where his older neighbor, Mrs. Pell, was watching Nessa for the evening. Callum had been returning from a late repair job when he found Sabine, and every minute he remained away made him feel more guilty. Yet taking a frightened stranger to the house where his daughter lived was unthinkable. Instead, he drove to the abandoned auto workshop he still rented on the industrial edge of town. It had belonged to his father and had once been busy enough to employ 7 mechanics. Now half the lights were dead, the roof leaked, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. Callum opened the side entrance, carried Sabine inside and settled her onto an old leather bench in the office. When he knelt to examine her ankle, she flinched before he touched her. Callum told her he was only checking whether it was broken. He had learned basic first aid years earlier while caring for his late wife, Mireia, through the illness that took her life. Sabine's ankle was badly sprained but not deformed. The deeper wound seemed to be the fear she was trying desperately to conceal. Callum found clean towels, an ice pack and an old sweatshirt left in a locker. Sabine changed behind the office door while he stood in the garage, listening to the rain hammer the metal roof. He kept thinking about Nessa asleep beneath the glow-in-the-dark stars Mireia had placed above her bed. 3 years earlier, Callum had promised his dying wife that their daughter would always feel safe. Since then, safety had become his only measure for every decision. He declined risky contracts, avoided confrontations, and worked himself nearly to exhaustion because stability mattered more than pride. Yet tonight he had driven away from a suspicious vehicle with an injured stranger in his truck. He was beginning to believe kindness and recklessness could wear the same face until it was too late to tell them apart. When Sabine emerged, the gray sweatshirt hung almost to her knees. Without the expensive dress and makeup, she looked less like a mysterious woman from a gala and more like someone who had not slept properly in weeks. Callum offered to contact a friend, a relative or anyone she trusted. Her expression hardened at the word trusted. She said the only person who might help her was dead, and the people chasing her had made certain of that. Then she opened her fist and showed him the silver key. It belonged to a private storage box at Central Union Bank, she explained, and inside was evidence proving that millions of dollars had been diverted from a charitable medical foundation. Callum had heard of the Vale Foundation. Its mobile clinics treated low-income families across the state. Mireya had once received medicine from one of those clinics when their insurance refused to cover it. Without that assistance, Callum might have lost his wife months sooner. He stared at Sabine, suddenly understanding why her last name had sounded familiar. Sabine was the founder's daughter and acting director of the foundation, but for the past year her authority had existed mostly on paper. Her uncle, Garrick Vale, controlled the board, the accounts, and nearly everyone around her. Sabine had discovered irregular payments months earlier, but whenever she questioned them, documents vanished and employees changed their stories. 2 nights ago, the foundation's elderly accountant, Tomas Varin, called her privately and admitted he had copied the original ledgers. Before he could deliver them, he died in what police were told was a fall down his apartment stairs. That evening, Sabine received an envelope containing the storage key and a handwritten note from Tomas warning her that someone close to her had already arranged to have her declared mentally unstable. At the gala, Garrick announced that Sabine would be taking an indefinite leave for exhaustion. 2 security men escorted her upstairs before she could object. She escaped through a service corridor, lost her shoes on a fire stairway and ran until her ankle gave out in front of Callum's truck. But there was one detail she had not yet admitted: the storage box could only be opened before noon the following day, when the bank would receive a court order transferring its contents to Garrick's attorneys. Callum felt the room shrink around him. He had not rescued a random stranger, he had stepped into a struggle involving people wealthy enough to manipulate doctors, lawyers, and police reports. Sabine wanted him to drive her to the bank when it opened, but Callum refused. He told her he had a daughter, a failing business and no protection against men who could erase evidence and manufacture lies. Sabine did not argue. She simply looked at the oil-stained floor and said she understood. Her acceptance should have relieved him, but it did the opposite. She had expected him to abandon her because everyone else already had. Callum recognized that look. He had worn it in hospital corridors when doctors stopped offering hope and friends stopped answering because they did not know what to say. Still, compassion did not pay funeral bills or raise a child after a parent made one brave, foolish decision. Callum drove Sabine to a small 24-hour motel under an assumed name and paid for the room with nearly all the cash he had earned that night. He gave her a prepaid phone and wrote down the number of a legal aid attorney who had once helped him negotiate medical debt. Sabine thanked him without meeting his eyes. At the door, she returned the workshop sweatshirt, but Callum told her to keep it. Then she asked him whether he remembered the mobile clinic that had helped Mireya. Callum froze. He had never mentioned his wife's name, only that the foundation had once helped his family. Sabine explained that she recognized him from an old photograph displayed at the foundation office. Mireya had written a letter thanking the clinic, and beside it was a picture of Callum holding baby Nessa while Mireya sat in a wheelchair. Sabine had kept that photograph because the letter ended with one sentence: "When people are frightened, they may ask you to leave, but love is often the decision to stay." Callum felt as though the past had reached through the motel doorway and placed a hand against his chest. Those were almost the same words Mireya had spoken during her final night. He left anyway. By the time Callum reached Mrs. Pell's house, the rain had weakened to a gray mist. Nessa was asleep on the sofa, hugging a stuffed fox by one ear. Callum carried her home and tucked her into bed, but sleep would not come to him. The overdue mortgage notice waited on the kitchen table. Beside it sat a drawing Nessa had made of their family, herself in the middle, Callum on one side and Mireya drawn as a bright yellow star above them. Underneath, in careful uneven letters, she had written, "Daddy fixes everything." Callum pressed his palms against his eyes. He could not fix everything. He could barely keep their electricity connected, and the workshop's final foreclosure hearing was 4 days away. Yet somewhere across town, an injured woman was preparing to face men who had already killed one person and stolen medicine from families like his. What kind of safety would he be teaching Nessa if it required him to ignore someone calling for help? At 5 in the morning, headlights appeared outside his house. Callum moved to the window and saw the dark sedan parked beneath the dead street lamp. A man stepped out, photographed the house and returned to the vehicle. Callum's blood went cold. He locked the doors, called Mrs. Pell and asked her to take Nessa to her sister's farm without explaining why. While Nessa sleepily packed her stuffed fox, she asked whether Callum was in trouble. He forced a smile and told her he was helping someone who could not walk alone. Nessa considered this seriously, then removed a small plastic compass from her backpack and pressed it into his hand. Mireya had given it to her during their last family camping trip. Nessa said it always helped people find their way home. Callum wanted to promise he would be back by dinner, but the sedan outside had already shown him that promises meant nothing to people determined to break them. The motel room was empty when he arrived. The bed had not been slept in, the prepaid phone lay smashed in the sink, and a dark streak of blood marked the edge of the bathroom counter. Callum's stomach dropped. He called Sabine's name, searched the parking lot and questioned the clerk, who admitted that 2 men had arrived less than an hour earlier claiming to be her brothers. Security footage showed them entering the room, but not leaving with her. Callum watched the recording again and noticed the laundry cart rolling through a rear exit shortly afterward. He followed the alley behind the motel and found one of Sabine's borrowed sneakers near a drainage grate. The rain had erased most tracks, but fresh tire marks led toward the highway. Callum contacted the police, only to be told that Sabine Vale had already been listed as a vulnerable adult experiencing a psychiatric crisis. Her family had reported that she was delusional, violent, and likely to invent accusations against people trying to help her. The trap had been prepared long before she escaped. Callum drove to the Vale Foundation headquarters, a glass building overlooking the river. He knew walking inside might expose him, but he had no other lead. The lobby was decorated with photographs of smiling families, mobile clinics, and children receiving medicine. Among them, almost hidden near a staircase, was Mireya's letter. Seeing her handwriting made Callum's knees weaken. Below the letter was the photograph Sabine had described. Someone had placed a small silver plaque beside it quoting Mireya's words about choosing to stay. Callum realized Sabine had not used the memory to manipulate him, she had genuinely carried it with her. A receptionist approached and asked whether she could help. Callum claimed he had come to thank Sabine for saving his wife years ago. The receptionist's expression shifted. Quietly, she told him Sabine had fought to keep the mobile clinic program alive while Garrick repeatedly tried to cut it. Then she slipped Callum a card belonging to Lenora Wicks, the Foundation's former compliance officer, and whispered that Sabine had trusted Lenora before she was suddenly dismissed. Lenora met Callum inside a crowded train station where cameras and witnesses made an abduction less likely. She was a guarded woman in her 60s who seemed prepared to walk away at the first sign of danger. When Callum showed her the silver key number that Sabine had written on the motel notepad, Lenora finally believed him. She revealed that the stolen Foundation money was only part of a larger scheme. Garrick had been selling confidential patient information to private debt collectors while inflating clinic expenses through shell companies. Tomas had found proof, and Sabine had secretly asked Lenora to build a case. Before they could act, Garrick fired Lenora and isolated Sabine from the board. The storage box contained duplicate ledgers, recorded conversations, and a sealed statement from Tomas. But there was another complication. Sabine herself had to open it because the box was registered under her biometric authorization. Without her, the evidence might remain locked until the court order placed it under Garrick's control. Callum asked where Garrick would take her. Lenora believed he would avoid hospitals because independent doctors might examine Sabine's injuries. The family owned a private rehabilitation estate 40 miles north, officially used for executive wellness retreats. In reality, it was remote, heavily guarded and operated by a physician indebted to Garrick. Callum called the police again and was told that family members were legally transporting Sabine to a treatment facility under an emergency medical recommendation. Without proof of abuse, officers would not intervene. Garrick had turned an abduction into healthcare paperwork. Callum looked at the plastic compass Nessa had given him. Its red needle trembled toward north, the same direction as the estate. Lenora warned him not to go alone, but Callum had spent 15 years repairing vehicles, entering locked lots and solving problems with whatever tools were available. He knew courage did not make him stronger than armed guards. It only made him willing to keep moving while afraid. Lenora agreed to contact an investigative journalist and prepare a live disclosure of everything she knew. If Callum could bring Sabine to the bank by noon, Lenora would ensure cameras were waiting. If he failed, she would release the incomplete evidence and hope it was enough to trigger an inquiry. It was a desperate plan with too many ways to collapse, but they had less than 4 hours remaining. The rehabilitation estate sat behind iron gates among wooded hills. Callum parked his truck near a service road and entered through a maintenance passage beside a generator shed. Years of repairing commercial heating systems had taught him that even expensive buildings depended on ordinary pipes, wires, and access panels. He cut power to the eastern wing, triggering alarms and forcing 2 guards outside to inspect the generator. Inside, the hall smelled of disinfectant and lavender. Callum checked room after room until he heard a metallic crash upstairs. He found Sabine strapped to a medical bed while a doctor prepared an injection. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and a bruise darkened her cheek. The doctor shouted for security. Callum shoved a supply cart against the door, cut the restraints with his pocket knife and tried to lift Sabine, but whatever medication she had already received left her unable to support her weight. When she recognized him, tears gathered in her eyes. She told him to take the key and leave her. The bank mattered more than she did. Callum remembered Mireia in the hospital, apologizing for becoming a burden as her body failed. He had told his wife then that love was not measured by how easily someone could be carried. Now, with footsteps pounding down the hallway, he gave Sabine the same answer he had given in the rain. He said no. He wrapped her arms around his neck and carried her through a rear stairwell as guards forced open the blocked door. Each floor seemed longer than the one before. Sabine faded in and out of consciousness, whispering that Garrick knew about Nessa. Callum nearly stumbled. She had overheard him order the guards to threaten Callum's daughter if he continued interfering. Rage surged through Callum, but terror followed it. He had sent Nessa away precisely to protect her, yet he had no idea whether Garrick's men had followed Mrs. Pell. There was no time to check. If he stopped now, Sabine would disappear, the evidence would be destroyed and Garrick would remain powerful enough to pursue them forever. They reached the laundry loading bay and found Garrick waiting beside Callum's truck. He was immaculate in a charcoal coat, as though the rain and mud had agreed not to touch him. 2 guards stood behind him. Garrick did not threaten Callum immediately. Instead, he offered to save his workshop. He knew about the foreclosure, the medical debt and every unpaid invoice. He promised to clear everything, establish a trust for Nessa and ensure Callum never worked another night shift. All Callum had to do was place Sabine in the waiting car and forget he had ever seen her. For one unbearable second, Callum imagined Nessa growing up in a secure home, attending good schools and never watching him count coins at the grocery store. Garrick had chosen the perfect weapon because poverty turned even a cruel offer into something that resembled love. Then Sabine stirred against Callum's shoulder and whispered that Garrick had offered Tomas the same bargain. Callum understood. Tomas had refused, and now he was dead. Callum shifted Sabine's weight, looked Garrick directly in the eyes and said his daughter deserved a father she could trust more than she needed a debt-free house. Then he hurled the plastic compass into the gravel behind the guards. The small movement made them turn instinctively. Callum rushed toward the truck, placed Sabine inside and locked the doors. One guard grabbed him before he could enter. Callum took a blow to the ribs, another to the jaw, and fell against the wet pavement. Garrick ordered the men not to kill him where cameras might exist. That hesitation saved him. Callum seized a wheel wrench from the truck bed, struck the ground near the guard's feet and forced enough space to climb inside. The windshield shattered as they accelerated through the loading gate, but the engine roared and held. For once, every unpaid hour Callum had spent keeping that old truck alive mattered. They had 90 minutes to reach the bank. Sabine fought the sedative while Callum drove through rain-slick mountain roads. Behind them, Garrick's vehicles appeared at every straight stretch. Lenora called to say the bank had received the court order early. Its attorneys were preparing to seal the box at 11:30, not noon. They had 46 minutes. Sabine tried to sit upright, but her legs would not respond. Panic overtook her as she remembered being restrained, and she begged Callum not to let them take her again. He told her to focus on Mireia's sentence and stay with him. Sabine repeated the words slowly, "When people are frightened, they may ask you to leave, but love is often the decision to stay." With each repetition, her breathing steadied. At the edge of the city, traffic stopped behind an overturned delivery van. Callum could see the bank towers only 2 miles away, but every lane was blocked. Garrick's sedan closed in behind them. Callum turned onto a narrow pedestrian service route beside the river, scraping the truck against a concrete barrier. The route ended at a locked maintenance gate. He rammed it once, twice, and on the third impact the chain snapped. Steam rose from the damaged hood. They reached the bank with 11 minutes remaining, but the truck died half a block from the entrance. Callum opened Sabine's door and tried to lift her. His ribs burned, his face was bleeding and his arms shook from exhaustion. Sabine looked at the distance to the bank and said she could not make it. Callum crouched in front of her and told her she did not have to make it alone. He carried her into the street as pedestrians stopped to stare. Lenora and several journalists waited outside the bank, their cameras already recording. Behind them, Garrick's car arrived. He stepped out shouting that Sabine was mentally ill and Callum had kidnapped her. 2 police officers moved toward them, but Lenora began reading Tomas's statement aloud into the cameras. Garrick's polished expression cracked for the first time. The officers ordered Callum to put Sabine down. Sabine raised the silver key and demanded access to her storage box while she was still legally authorized. The bank manager hesitated, trapped between the court order and the growing crowd. Then an elderly teller recognized Sabine and opened the security doors, saying the transfer time stamped on the order was 11:30 exactly. The clock above the lobby showed 11:28. Callum carried Sabine through the marble hall as Garrick pushed past reporters behind them. The vault elevator seemed to descend forever. At the storage level, Sabine pressed her thumb against the scanner, but the machine rejected it because her hand was wet and trembling. 11:29 appeared on the digital clock. She tried again. Rejected. Garrick's attorneys entered the corridor with a bank official holding the court order. Callum dried Sabine's hand on his shirt and enclosed her fingers in his own until the shaking eased. On the third attempt, the scanner flashed green. The box opened with 7 seconds remaining. Inside were ledgers, audio recordings, patient lists, and Tomas's sealed declaration. There was also a second envelope addressed to Sabine. While reporters photographed the evidence, Garrick attempted to leave, but officers stopped him after Lenora played a recording of his voice ordering Tomas to destroy the files and threatening what would happen if he refused. Garrick's certainty vanished. He demanded a lawyer, accused Sabine of betrayal and insisted everything he had done was to protect the Vale name. Sabine looked at the stolen patient records and answered that a name worth protecting should never require sacrificing the people it promised to serve. The criminal investigation spread across 3 states. Garrick and several executives were charged with fraud, coercion, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy related to Tomas's death. The physician who sedated Sabine surrendered his license and agreed to testify. Millions were recovered, though not all of the missing funds could be traced. For weeks, Sabine struggled to walk without assistance. The physical injury healed faster than the fear. Sudden footsteps made her flinch, locked doors made her panic, and sleep brought her back to the medical bed. Callum visited her rehabilitation center after work, sometimes with Nessa beside him. He never demanded that Sabine become strong quickly. He simply stayed through the difficult exercises, the angry silences and the days when progress seemed to disappear. Nessa took her role seriously. She drew bright arrows along Sabine's walking chart and placed the recovered plastic compass on the therapy room windowsill. Mrs. Pell had found it in the gravel after police searched the estate. Nessa told Sabine that North did not move even when people became lost. Sabine cried harder at those words than she had during any painful therapy session. For years, she had believed strength meant standing without anyone's help. A 6-year-old child taught her that strength could also mean accepting the hand offered beside you. One afternoon, Sabine opened Tomas's private envelope. Inside was a copy of Mireya's original letter and a note explaining why he had chosen the storage box. Tomas had once worked at the clinic where Mireya received treatment. He remembered Callum arriving after every shift, carrying Nessa in one arm and Mireya's medicine in the other. Tomas wrote that witnessing their family had reminded him what the foundation was supposed to protect. When he later discovered the fraud, Mireya's words gave him the courage to preserve the evidence. The woman Callum had lost years earlier had unknowingly inspired the men who exposed Garrick, the woman who escaped him and the decision Callum made on a rain-soaked street. Mireya had not been present that night, yet her kindness had guided every step toward the vault. Callum's workshop was still scheduled for foreclosure. Sabine offered to pay the debt personally, but he refused because he did not want his rescue to become a transaction. She respected that answer, though it left her searching for another way to help. During the investigation, auditors discovered that the Foundation's fleet maintenance contracts had been among those corrupted by Garrick's shell companies. Sabine proposed a transparent public bidding process to replace them. Callum submitted an application alongside dozens of companies and won, not because of Sabine's influence, but because his repair records, prices, and safety history ranked highest. The contract allowed him to save the workshop, rehire 2 former mechanics and begin paying down the bills with money he had earned. For the first time since Mireya's death, Callum no longer felt as though his life was shrinking around him. Months later, the Vale Foundation reopened its mobile clinic program under independent oversight. The first restored clinic stopped in Callum's neighborhood, parked beside the school where Nessa attended first grade. Sabine arrived using a cane. She could walk again, though slowly, and every step remained a quiet victory. Callum watched her cross the pavement toward the photograph of Mireya displayed inside the clinic. Sabine touched the frame and admitted that during her darkest moment, she had believed being left behind was inevitable. Callum told her he had almost left. He wanted her to know that courage had not come naturally or cleanly. It had come after fear, doubt, and one wrong decision he was fortunate enough to correct. Sabine smiled and said that staying mattered more because he had understood the cost. Their lives did not transform into a perfect story. Callum still worked long hours. Sabine still attended therapy. Nessa still woke some nights asking whether her mother could see them from wherever she was. But the 3 of them slowly formed a bond built not on rescue, obligation, or gratitude, but on the ordinary choice to show up. Sabine helped Nessa with reading. Callum repaired the old Foundation vans. Nessa placed the compass in a small frame inside the workshop with a handwritten label, "The night Dad found the way." A year after the storm, Sabine walked without a cane at a memorial for Tomas and Mireya outside the new community clinic. She crossed the garden slowly while Callum and Nessa waited beneath a flowering tree. Halfway there, her injured leg trembled. The crowd became silent. Callum started toward her, but Sabine lifted one hand. She wanted to finish those last few steps herself. She reached them, embraced Nessa and then looked at Callum with tears shining in her eyes. She said that when she had told him she could not walk, she had not only meant her injured ankle. She had meant she could no longer see a path through the betrayal, fear and loneliness surrounding her. Callum had carried her body that night, but his refusal to abandon her had given her the courage to reclaim her life. Callum looked toward Mireya's photograph beside the memorial plaque and finally understood the mystery that had followed him since the rain. Why had he been on that street at precisely that moment? Why had Sabine kept Mireya's letter? Why had Tomas preserved it? Perhaps there was no grand design, only kindness passing quietly from one person to another until, years later, it returned when someone needed it most. Mireya's compassion had reached beyond her lifetime, moved through Tomas and Sabine, and found its way back to the husband and daughter she left behind. If this story touched your heart, please support the video by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Oxley Stories. Your engagement helps stories of courage, compassion, and second chances reach people who may be facing their own darkest night. Before the story ends, please comment, "I would have stayed," if you believe no frightened person should be abandoned when they need help most. As the memorial ended, Nessa took Sabine's hand on one side and Callum's on the other. Together, they walked toward the clinic while evening sunlight filled the windows and reflected across the newly painted vans. Callum no longer believed he could fix everything, and he no longer needed to. Some wounds required medicine, some required justice, and some healed only because another person remained beside you long enough to prove that pain did not have the final word. On the night Sabine begged to be left behind, Callum had carried her away from danger. But in the year that followed, they discovered the truth neither had expected: sometimes the person you refuse to abandon is the very person who helps you find your way home.